Rendezvous on the Green River, early 1830s. The Green River Valley shook with noise that morning, shouts in half a dozen tongues, the hollow clang of trade kettles, the crack-thump of a dozen bored trappers firing their rifles into cottonwoods just to see which one still shot true. The air smelled of horses, smoke, and the heavy sweetness of beaver plews stacked in long rows like cordwood. Bright crow lodges stood beside the darker hide lodges of the Shoshone, their smoke vents turning slowly in the thin breeze. Down near the water, the American Fur Company men bellowed prices, countersinging the Rocky Mountain Fur Company traders who argued with equal vigor. It had the feel of a fair, a camp, and a war council all at once, the timeless confusion of a Rocky Mountain rendezvous. Into this din walked Elias Carter, moving with the slow, deliberate step of a man who had survived too many winters. He looked older than his years, though no one at the rendezvous could say exactly how many years that was. Some guessed 40, others 50. All agreed on this much. The man's body had been carved by the land. His left shoulder sat slightly lower from an old break. A pale scar crossed one cheek like a claw mark half-healed. His eyes, sharp gray, held that peculiar stillness seen in men who had tracked animals longer than they had spoken to people. He came to trade beaver, but it was not the pelts that made men glance at him. Elias Carter was known for two things, both equally improbable. The first was his fool's map. Every man had heard of it, a scrap of old Spanish parchment he kept inside an oilskin pouch tucked beneath his shirt. A map, he claimed, that pointed the way to a lost Spanish mine somewhere north of Taos, a place older than the fur trade, older than any American presence, older even than the founding of the new Mexican state. Men called it nonsense, whiskey vapor, the sort of tale told by greenhorns trying to sound important. Spaniards never dug that deep up here, they'd say. They barely set foot past the Sangre de Cristos. Yet the story persisted because Elias persisted. He never bragged about the map, never tried to sell it or bait investors. He just kept it, as if it were something he owed a promise to. The second thing, equally strange, was his crazy way of hunting grizzlies. Most trappers simply tried to avoid them. A few fools hunted them head-on, and most of those ended up as campfire warnings. But Elias had a method that was whispered about with a mix of amusement and awe, something involving rawhide strips, the wind, and the lay of the land, a technique that somehow forced a grizzly to charge along a single narrow path, a trick that let him take the deadly shot close, clean, and sure. It was that trick that drew everyone's attention the morning the trouble started. A young trapper barely whiskered, full of the kind of foolhardiness that comes from surviving one winter and thinking it a lifetime, had wandered too near the berry bushes edging the timber. Men heard the noise before they saw the danger. A low, rolling grunt, the sound of heavy brush tearing aside, then the awful bellow that meant a grizzly was charging. The boy ran, but the bear covered ground like a landslide. Several men reached for rifles, but the distance was wrong, the angles terrible. A bad shot would only enrage the bear further. Someone shouted, "He's done for!" Elias didn't shout, he didn't curse, he simply moved. A few minutes earlier, he had hung strips of rawhide from a cottonwood near the berry patch. No one had asked why, assuming it was some eccentric's nonsense. But now the rawhide swung in the breeze, clacking faintly, twisting the scent of blood and hide into the air. The bear, barreling after the boy, suddenly slowed as the scent reached him. Grizzlies always circled downwind when confused. Elias seemed to know the exact moment the wind would shift, for he stepped into the shadowed dip between two boulders and raised his heavy rifle. "Get down," he barked at the boy. The youngster dropped flat just as the grizzly made its decision. Instead of turning on the boy, it angled toward the smell, toward Elias's ragged trap made of nothing but instinct and rawhide and wind. The terrain funneled the bear through a narrow gap. Elias had chosen his ground perfectly. The shot came at near point-blank distance. A single thunderclap, a spray of dirt, a roar that broke off mid-breath. The bear collapsed not 10 feet from Elias's boots. For a long moment, the rendezvous fell strangely quiet. Men stared at the fallen bear, at the young trapper trembling on the ground, and then at Elias Carter, who reloaded calmly, as if hunting a grizzly so near he could smell its breath, were the most natural thing in the world. Someone muttered, "Damn fool trick worked again." Another said, "One day that man's gonna die doing something like that." A third, older mountain man shook his head. "Reckon that trick keeps him alive more often than it kills him." The boy, pale as new snow, stumbled to his feet and managed a shaky, "Thank you, sir." Elias only nodded. "Watch the wind next time." He said it without judgment, as if teaching a simple lesson in trapping beaver. Later, after the bear was skinned and the hide stretched, after whiskey bottles had been passed around and the story had already grown in the retelling, a small circle of trappers gathered around Elias near his fire. They were a mixed lot: French-Canadian voyageurs, Scots-Irish Kentuckians, Métis hunters, seasoned men from Ashley's old expeditions. One of them leaned in. "Carter, tell us straight." "That Spanish map of yours, where'd you get it?" Another snorted. "He ain't got no map. Just a piece of old saddle leather he keeps for luck." A third said, "If Spaniards worked mines up here, we'd have found 'em already." The talk grew louder, teasing but edged. Men at Rendezvous had died over less. Elias watched the flames crackle for a moment, eyes reflecting the firelight, like a man looking a long way back. He could have ignored them. He could have laughed it off. Instead, he set down his tin cup, drew the oilskin pouch from inside his shirt, and held it between his fingers, not opening it, just holding it. "You all want to know?" he asked softly. The circle fell silent. Elias looked toward the dark ridge beyond the river, toward the stretches of land where he had walked as a younger man, hungrier, greener, and far more reckless. "I'll tell it," he said finally. "But to tell it true, I've got to start at the beginning." He leaned back, fire crackling, smoke drifting upward, and the story slipped, like a trail disappearing over a rise, into the past. Upper Arkansas River Country, late 1820s. The memory came back to Elias the way all frontier memories do, slow at first, then sharp and sudden, like a blade glinting as it clears the sheath. He had been younger then. Lean as a fence rail, long-legged, with that peculiar sharpness in the eye that comes from a man who has not yet learned how close death walks beside him. He had left Kentucky with nothing more than a knife, a borrowed rifle, and the stubborn belief that the world beyond the Appalachians surely held a place meant for him. By the time he reached Street, Lewis, he'd fallen in with a small trapping outfit heading toward Taos, 7 men in all, most seasoned. 2 greenhorns, including Elias. They followed the Arkansas River west, skirting its bends, watching the plains rise into the high blue mountains of Spanish New Mexico. It was near the river's southward sweep, in a ravine littered with broken mesquite, that they first saw the wreckage. A wagon lay on its side, wheels shattered, canvas torn to ribbons. A mule carcass sprawled nearby, swarmed by flies. Trade goods lay scattered bolt: cloth, clay pots, a few small iron tools. The whole scene bore the unmistakable mark of a raid. Comanche sign, most likely. Arrow shafts snapped underfoot, a single feather caught in sagebrush, the kind of swift violence they were known for. The trappers approached carefully, rifles up. Then someone gasped. A man still lived. He lay half under a crate, dark-skinned, blanket-wrapped, blood seeping through slashes across his chest. Gray hair spilled from beneath his battered sombrero. He looked old, older than any vaquero they'd seen on the frontier roads. And he clutched something to his breast, with a grip so tight it seemed death itself could not pry it loose. They called out in Spanish, in French, in sign. Only Elias knelt close enough to hear the rasping whisper, "Agua." Elias raised the man's head, holding a tin cup to his lips. The water spilled more than it entered, but the man tried. His eyes fluttered open, black, bright, full of desperate clarity. "Mapa," he croaked. The others exchanged glances. Another fever-dream muttering old Mexican spoke when close to death, they thought. Nothing new. But the vaquero tightened his grip and forced Elias's hand toward his chest. Elias gently pulled aside the blood-soaked blanket and found a leather packet, stiff, folded, stained. The dying man clutched Elias's wrist. "Las minas perdidas, las minas de los frailes, enterradas, escondidas." Lost mines, mines of the friars, hidden. A couple of the trappers laughed under their breath. "Spanish gold again," one muttered. Every dying Mexican has a treasure tale. But Elias didn't laugh. Something in the man's eyes held him still, something like a plea or a warning. The vaquero's breaths grew shallow, ragged. With trembling fingers he pulled free a scrap of parchment from the leather packet. Symbols lay drawn in faded ink, jagged peaks, a forked river, what looked like a cross atop a rock spire. Strange Spanish notations, leaned crookedly across the edge distances, maybe. Or warnings. The dying man pressed the parchment into Elias's hand. El obispo, la roca del obispo, sigue el río bifurcado. The bishop, the bishop's rock. Follow the forked river. Blood soaked the parchment as he spoke. When his hand finally fell away, the ravine went quiet. No one said a word for several seconds. Even the wind seemed to hush. Then the spell broke. "Give it here," grunted one of the older trappers, grabbing for the parchment, but Elias stepped back. "It was given to me." Given or not, the others saw no worth in it. They passed the torn parchment around, scoffing in turn. "Looks like a child's drawing. Ain't no Spaniards came this far. Even if they did, that mine's dust now. Digging for gold gets men killed faster than the Blackfeet." When the parchment returned to him, Elias folded it carefully, placed it back into the leather packet, and tucked it inside his shirt. No one bothered trying to take it a second time. There was nothing on it worth stealing, or so they said. They buried the vaquero on a rise above the ravine, marked the grave with stones, and moved on before nightfall. But Elias kept hearing those whispered words, the bishop's rock, the forked river, lost mines of the friars. That night, as the others drank and joked around the fire, Elias held the map in his hands, studying every strange line. He could not explain why it mattered or why it felt like more than a dying man's delirium. All he knew was this. Something in that parchment stirred the same quiet instinct that told him when storms were coming, when animals were near, when danger crept invisibly through the timber. A feeling that said, "This is real. This is meant for you." When one of the older trappers noticed him staring at the map, he spat into the fire and shook his head. "Boy, listen well. Spanish gold's killed more men than Grizzlies ever will. Leave it be." But Elias didn't leave it be. He folded the map once more, slipped it back inside his shirt, and lay awake, long into the night, listening to the wind move through the cottonwoods, wondering if it carried the whisper of old Spaniards, old friars, old curses. It was the first night the dream began. The first night he saw in his sleep a towering rock shaped like a bishop's mitre and a forked river shining beneath it like two blades of silver. And so the story that began with a dying vaquero and a map stained with his last breath settled into Elias Carter like a seed the mountains themselves would one day force into bloom. Southern Rockies, Elias's first true season in the mountains. The mountains have a way of stripping a young man down to the truth of himself. By the time Elias Carter reached the Southern Rockies the following spring, he had lost whatever softness Kentucky had given him. The wind there blew through a man like judgment. The cold bit harder than any winter he'd known. And the work setting traps along half-frozen streams, dressing hides with numb fingers, hauling plews on weary mules, took the stiffness out of pride and left only what was useful. The trapping party he fell in with that season was smaller, 5 men instead of 7, and much harder. French-Canadian voyageurs, 2 seasoned Americans, and a quiet Métis hunter named Baptiste, who spoke little but watched everything. They taught Elias fast how to read mud for sign, how to hide his scent by rolling in sagebrush, how to set a trap on the downstream edge of a beaver lodge where the animals rarely looked for danger. But there was one lesson every man emphasized above all others. Beware the grizzly. Stories of Hugh Glass were already traveling up and down the mountains, how he'd been torn near to pieces by a she-bear and still crawled miles to survive. Every rendezvous repeated the tale, with new scars added, new horrors described. The message was clear. The beaver might bite, the Blackfeet might strike, but the grizzly destroyed without hesitation and rarely without reason. Elias listened, but watching wasn't enough to prepare a man. The lesson came for real one bitter morning in late spring. He and 2 of the older trappers, Greeley and Cormac, were checking a line of traps along a creek choked with willow and choke cherry, when the world seemed to explode out of the brush. A roar like a steam kettle hammered the air. A mass of brown fur and muscle burst from a thicket not 20 paces ahead. The bear rose to its hind legs, towering, its breath smoking in the cold morning. Cormac fired too quickly, panic in the shot. The ball struck the bear's shoulder, only enraging it. Greeley's rifle misfired with a hollow click that sounded like a death sentence. The grizzly charged. Elias didn't think he felt the wind shift against his face, felt the ground slight hollow where water had carved a narrow trough, felt where the bear would run not because he saw it, but because the land and air told him, the way they always did. He shouted, "Downstream! Move!" Cormac stumbled backward. Greeley dropped flat. Elias darted toward a fallen cottonwood, its trunk angled just so, creating a narrow gap between it and a sandstone boulder. He backed into position, raising his rifle. The bear thundered past the tree on the exact path Elias had sensed. He fired at near-killing distance. The shot struck the bear just behind the jaw, shattering bone and dropping the beast mid-stride. It slid in a spray of dirt, claws gouging the earth until the great body stilled. For a moment, none of them moved. Cormac finally breathed, "Boy, how in God's name did you know where he'd run?" Elias didn't know how to explain it. He just lifted his chin toward the wind. He'd take the path where scent was thinnest. Bears don't like running blind. Greeley stared at him with new respect. That's good sense, or mad luck. But Elias felt something spark inside him, a quiet, dangerous idea. If a man knew how a bear would circle when confused, if he understood how wind twisted around rock and timber, if he learned the terrain the way he learned the habits of beaver, could he make a bear predictable? The thought had weight, shape, possibility. Over the next weeks, as they moved through the timbered valleys and sagebrush benches, Elias watched the great bears more than he watched anything else. He studied their sign, the bends in their tracks, the way they approached carrion or berry patches. He noted the way they always circled downwind if something smelled strange. He noticed they took the easiest path when charging through bottlenecks, between fallen logs, through narrow cuts in the land. Patterns, rhythms, instinct wrapped in muscle. One evening, he dragged a mule carcass killed by a cougar days earlier into a narrow game trail between two spruce thickets. He hung rawhide strips above it, twisted with scraps of cloth soaked in bear grease and a bit of whiskey. He wrestled with the wind, waiting until it blew steady and sure. Baptiste, watching quietly, finally asked in French, "What madness is this?" Elias only said, "You'll see." The next dawn, they heard the bear before they saw it, heavy breaths. The crack of branches, the low growl of a hungry boar drawn by the reek. Elias and Baptiste took positions on opposite sides of the bottleneck, rifles leveled. The bear approached cautiously. Then it caught the mixed scents rawhide, grease, whiskey, and circled downwind, exactly as Elias predicted. The terrain forced it into the funnel between the spruce thickets. Elias whispered, "Now." 2 shots cracked as one. The bear fell. Baptiste stared at Elias, awe and disbelief fighting for place in his expression. "That is the craziest thing I have ever witnessed." Word of it traveled faster than fire on percenter, dry grass. Men called it foolishness, witchcraft, genius, or luck, depending on which story they heard and how much whiskey they'd had, but Elias didn't care. He hadn't invented the mountains. He'd only learned to listen to them. And yet, every night, when the fire burned low, he still reached inside his shirt and touched the folded Spanish map, the dying vaquero's last gift. 2 obsessions had begun to grow inside him. One, born of instinct, the grizzly trick. The other, born of blood and mystery, the lost Spanish mine. Both would shape his life. Both would lead him into country no map had ever captured accurately. Both would test him far more than he knew, and only one would nearly cost him everything. From Taos into the Central Rockies, beyond the known trapping grounds. By midsummer, the mountains had shaped Elias Carter into something quieter, harder, and far more dangerous than the green youth who had left Kentucky. His name carried weight in Taos, now whispered by traders, repeated by hunters. eyed with interest by mestizo muleteers who had heard of El Cazador Loco de Osos, the crazy bear hunter whose trick worked twice as often as any sensible method should. But reputation, like beaver, was a thing that spoiled fast. Elias was restless. The Spanish map gnawed at him like a tooth that would not quit aching. The dying vaquero's words returned nightly: El Obispo, La Roca del Obispo, the Bishop's Rock, the Forked River. The trouble was simple and impossible. The places drawn on the map existed nowhere. Any trapper had ever described, neither in Fitzpatrick's trails, nor Smith's routes, nor any story drifting up from the Great Basin or the Arkansas. The Rockies held a great many secrets, but this one lay somewhere north of the usual circuits, and north in those days meant danger. Still, Elias went. He traveled with a small party, just 3 men this time. Baptiste came without hesitation. French-Canadian voyageurs were born with curiosity carved into their bones. A wiry, bow-legged trapper named Rowan joined them too, claiming boredom, but Elias suspected the man simply wanted to see if the wild legends about Carter were true. Their path took them up the valley of the Rio Grande, across rolling plains where buffalo darkened the horizon, then into the broken ridges of the upper San Luis Valley. From there, they climbed toward lands that most men avoided. Not because the country lacked beaver, it had plenty, but because the tribes who claimed it watched strangers the way a hawk watches a field mouse. Crow's sign appeared first, a smashed squirrel, feathers tied into a branch, a line of stones pointing north. Baptiste read them with a shrug. Warning, maybe, or only sign they pass here often. A day later, they found wolf tracks trailing their camp by moonlight. Rowan spat in the dirt. "Ain't no wolf walked that neat. That's 2 legs, not 4. Elias nodded. "We're watched." But the watchers did nothing more than watch. No arrows, no shouts, no riders, only distant silhouettes on ridgelines, present one heartbeat and gone the next. Elias took that as a sign not of welcome, but of tolerance. They were allowed to pass, for now. It was in this uneasy quiet that Elias's instincts sharpened again. One morning, the sky showed no threat, yet he felt pressure in the air, something heavy, silent. He said only, "We move fast today." Baptiste didn't ask why. Rowan did, but Elias's expression silenced him. Hours later, a storm rolled over the peaks, so suddenly it seemed born from the granite itself. Lightning danced along the ridges, and hail hammered the ground where they'd camped the previous night. Had they lingered, all 3 men would have been buried beneath falling timber. "Your nose is witchcraft," Rowan muttered that night as they huddled beside a small fire. "Not witchcraft," Elias said, "just the land talking." But the truth was harder than that. The land talked to everyone. Elias simply listened better. Several days later, they topped a high pass and saw something that turned the Spanish map from fantasy into possibility. Below them ran a river, wide and gleaming, splitting into 2 distinct branches. One cut through red stone, its canyon walls glowing like embers under the afternoon sun. The other carved into darker timberland, where shadows pooled like ink. The angles were wrong, the scale uncertain, but the shape matched the parchment. And rising above the forks stood a rock formation unlike anything Elias had seen. A spire of pale sandstone twisted upward, flaring at the top like a carved mitre worn by a bishop in some distant cathedral. Elias felt the breath leave his chest. Baptiste saw his face and whispered, "Mon Dieu, the Bishop's Rock." Rowan whistled low. "Hell, maybe your map ain't madness after all." They made camp on a ledge overlooking the Forked River, and Elias studied the land below for a long time without speaking. This place, this valley, felt wrong and right all at once. Wrong because so few had ever spoken of it. Right because every instinct in him pulsed with recognition. The map was crudely drawn. The old vaquero's hand had trembled. But certain shapes, certain distances interpreted from the perspective of a man approaching from the south, aligned with unsettling clarity. As if the dead Spaniard had truly stood somewhere near this very ridge and scratched what he saw onto parchment. The next day they followed the left fork, climbing along a narrow bench marked by elk tracks and patches of berry bushes. The land grew stranger as they pressed deeper. Fallen stone steps carved into a cliffside, timber fragments wedged into cracks, and one toppled column half swallowed by earth, etched faintly with crosses. Rowan crouched beside the debris. "This ain't Indian work." "No," Elias said. "It's older." "Mexican?" "Before Mexico." Baptiste touched the carved stone gently. "Españols." A cold breeze swept the canyon then, shifting the smell of dust and pine. Elias felt a shiver crawl up his spine, not fear, not exactly, but the sense of a threshold crossed. They had entered a place no American, no company trapper, no mountain wanderer had likely seen in decades. A forbidden country, a forgotten country, a place where the Spanish had once worked, prayed, sweated, and bled under orders long erased from memory. The map was real. The Bishop's Rock was real. The forked river was real. And whatever lay deeper in this valley, hidden behind stone and brush and time, was real too. Elias knew then there was no turning back. The mountains had opened their secret. And secrets, once found, demanded a price. Deep canyon off the forked river, evidence of vanished Spaniards, the canyon narrowed as they followed the left fork, the walls rising steep and close like jaws, ready to swallow whatever dared trespass. Morning light rarely reached the floor, and even at midday the shadows lay thick as wool. The silence pressed in too, no wind, no bird call, only the muffled clop of mule hooves and the rasp of their own breathing. Rowan muttered more than once, "Feels like walking into a grave." Even Baptiste, usually unshakable, glanced often over his shoulder. Elias said little. His eyes traced every bend in the canyon, every notch and ridge, comparing them to the shapes etched on the parchment he carried close to his chest. And each time he found a match, a twist in the river, a slanted ridge, a rock shelf, his certainty deepened. By mid-morning they reached a place where the river curled sharply, almost doubling back against the cliff. The ground there was littered with stone that had not fallen naturally, blocks cut on straight lines, scattered like the bones of some long-dead animal. Then Rowan crouched beside a squared timber, half buried in silt. "Looks like support bracin'," he said, running a finger over its softened edge. "Old, though, real old." Baptiste brushed away a layer of dust from a piece of iron driven through one end. It had rusted to flakes, but its shape was unmistakable. A Spanish-style drill spike, the kind used for early mining. Elias felt the canyon tighten around them with invisible hands. They pressed on, pushing the mules up a rocky incline, until the land opened into a bowl-shaped ledge. What they saw there made all three men go still. A collapsed adit, a mine shaft, yawned at the base of the cliff. The entrance was mostly blocked by a spill of stone, but the shape remained, a squared opening framed by carefully placed timbers, now rotted into spongy brown husks. Above it, someone long ago had carved small crosses in the rock, some crude, some careful, a few were nearly worn away. Baptiste whispered something in French that sounded halfway between prayer and fear. Rowan let out a low, disbelieving whistle. "Well, I'll be damned. Spaniards did dig up here." Elias stepped closer, touching the carved stone lightly. The rock felt warm beneath the sun, but something colder seemed to lurk behind it, an echo of men who had labored, sweated, bled in this exact spot under orders from a crown that no longer existed. He walked the length of the ledge. Everywhere he looked were subtle signs, hand-cut steps leading to a small upper shelf, a rusted chisel, its edge long blunted. Fragments of ceramic, white and blue, almost certainly Spanish majolica. And near the cliff wall, half hidden by brush, a splintered wooden post with faint scorch marks at its base. Rowan nudged it with his boot. "Looked like they had a watchfire here." "They guarded it," Elias murmured. Whatever they dug, it mattered. Baptiste wandered near the collapsed shaft, crouched, and pulled something from the dirt. "Voyez," he said, holding it out. Elias turned the object in his hand. It was a small smelted bar of metal rough, tarnished, and no larger than a child's hand. But even dulled with age, its weight spoke clearly. Silver, or something close enough. Rowan exhaled sharply. "You mean to tell me that old Vaquero's ghost story was true?" Elias kept staring at the bar, its surface pitted with time. "It was never a ghost story." The three men exchanged a look that held equal parts triumph and dread. This discovery was greater than any cache of beaver, any trail of buffalo, any new trapping ground, and it carried a heavier shadow. They could have turned back then, should have, taken the bar as proof and left the canyon to its ghosts, but greed or curiosity or pride tightened its grip on them. They cleared the front of the collapsed adit, working slowly with picks and mule lines to drag stones aside. The deeper they dug, the more the air changed dry, metallic, tinged with the smell of old earth. Inside, a dark hollow appeared, like the open mouth of a cave waiting to speak. Rowan lit a pine pitch torch and stepped just inside the entrance. Elias followed. The timber supports sagged dangerously. Shafts of sunlight pierced through cracks like thin, bright knives. They found a short tunnel, no more than 20 paces deep, ending in a wall of exposed veined, dull gray streaks shot through with the faintest shimmer. "Silver-bearing ore," Rowan said softly. "Not much left, but they hit something once." At the far end lay a rusted iron crowbar and the half-rotten remains of a leather satchel. Elias lifted the satchel gingerly. It fell apart in his hand. Dust leaked out, dust mixed with small, pebble-like chunks of processed ore. Someone had worked this place in earnest. Someone had intended to come back. Outside the shaft, Baptiste had wandered farther down the ledge. "Venezisi!" he called. They found him standing over a low foundation of stones, forming a narrow rectangle. Post holes lined the earth around it. Scattered in the dirt were bits of broken pottery, a rotted strip of mule harness, and most startling, a tarnished religious medallion depicting St. Francis. "A barracks," Elias said. "Or a watch station. Or a chapel," Rowan added. The air in the canyon seemed to grow heavier. The sun slipped behind a cloud, casting everything in a colder shade. Elias looked toward the north end of the canyon, where the rock walls bent inward like the arch of a doorway. "This place ain't abandoned by accident," he said quietly. Baptiste nodded in agreement. "None. Something happened here." No one said what they were all thinking. Men had died for this place. Maybe miners, maybe soldiers, maybe friars who had pleaded for it to be closed. Elias felt the mountain's silence gather like breath before a warning. The map was real. The mine was real. The danger, too, was real and close. But turning back was no longer an option. The canyon had revealed only its first secret, and the mountains, Elias knew, always demanded more. Late spring into early summer, deep in the canyon of the lost mine, they should have left the moment they uncovered the smelted bar. Every mountain man with more than a season behind him knew the rule. Take your proof and get out before the land notices what you've stolen from it. But the canyon had its claws in them now. Rowan wanted more ore to show the traders in Taos, convinced a larger sample would secure backing from wealthy men. Baptiste argued the opposite, that nothing good would come from staying in a place the Spaniards themselves had abandoned. Elias said little, because his mind warred with itself, instinct screaming danger, while something deeper, older, urged him on. So they stayed. Every day they pried at the fallen stones around the adit, widening the entrance. They hauled out buckets of loose ore and dust, stacked timbers to brace sagging beams, and lit pitch torches that threw jittering shadows against the rock. Elias felt the mountain watching them. He felt the weight of old things, prayers, curses, greed pressing in with every bucket they carried. To make matters worse, the canyon reeked now. With every mule that slipped and every deer they took for meat, the smell of blood pooled in the air. Carcasses attracted scavengers. Scavengers attracted predators. And predators, in this part of the Rockies, meant one thing. The first sign was a track the size of a dinner plate pressed into the mud near the river. Rowan squatted beside it. "That's a big one. Old boar by the look. Claws long as my fingers." Baptiste's voice was tight. "He is watching us." Elias didn't argue. He felt it too, felt the prickle between his shoulders each time he carried water from the river, felt the silence that shouldn't have been silence, felt eyes in the timber above. Something was out there. Something patient. They set watches at night. They kept fires burning. Elias rigged a few of his strange, wind-scented contraptions near the lower trail rawhide strips, scraps of bloody cloth, Bits of offal hung from branches. Rowan called it madness, but he helped anyway. "You and your crazy bear fences," he muttered. "They ain't fences," Elias said. "They're signals." Signals to who? To the bear. The tension wound tighter each day. The deeper they worked into the shaft, the more the timbers groaned, the more the smell of metal and old air burned in their lungs. It wasn't long before Rowan's greed overpowered his reason. "We're wasting time scratching at rock," he said one evening. "We got powder. Let's use it." Elias stiffened. "You blast inside a closed shaft, it'll bring the whole mountain down." "Not if we're careful." "There ain't no careful with black powder." But Rowan was past listening. Greed had taken him by the throat. That night, while Elias and Baptiste slept in the lean-to, Rowan crept into the shaft with a powder horn and a short fuse. The explosion came like a thunderclap smothered under earth. The canyon shook. Dust and rock belched from the adit like breath from a dragon. Elias bolted upright, heart slamming his ribs. Baptiste was already on his feet, rifle in hand. They reached the shaft to find Rowan on the ground, coughing, bloodied from flying stone. Worse, the blast had destabilized the entire front of the tunnel. Stones continued to fall in a slow, deadly trickle. "You damned fool," Elias snarled, dragging him back. "You could have killed us all." "I was trying to find the deep vein." Rowan hacked blood into his hand. "Didn't think it'd drop so fast." Elias opened his mouth to curse him again, but then the sound reached them. A low, rumbling growl that vibrated through the soles of their boots. The old boar had finally come, not cautiously, not curious, angry. The blast had drawn him like a beacon. "Get ready," Elias whispered. Branches cracked above them. A heavy silhouette moved between the fir trees. Not the clumsy shuffle of a wandering bear. This was a charge, aimed and deliberate. Rowan scrambled up, terrified. "What do we do?" Elias's mind sharpened, clearing like a river after the silt settles. The blast had scattered blood and dust everywhere. The bear would circle downwind, he always would. And the downwind funnel led straight to the narrow path between the ore sleds and the propped timbers. Elias ran. "Baptiste, take the right side. Rowan left ridge." "What ridge?" "Move." They scrambled into position as the grizzly burst into view. The bear was monstrous, scarred, matted, its fur silvered with age. It sniffed, turned, and bellowed loud enough to shake the needles from the trees. Then, just as Elias predicted, it circled into the funnel. Elias steadied his rifle. His breath slowed. His heart didn't. As the bear thundered through the narrow line of fallen timbers, Baptiste fired first his. Shot slamming into the bear's ribs. It staggered, but didn't fall. Elias stepped from behind the ore sled. The bear saw him. Charged. 10 feet. 8. 6. Elias fired point blank. The ball punched through the bear's skull. Momentum carried the beast another few feet before it collapsed in a rolling crash that shook the ground. Silence followed. Even the canyon seemed to hold its breath. Rowan sank to his knees. Baptiste crossed himself. Elias stood over the fallen giant, chest heaving. "That's the last bear I hunt in this canyon," he said quietly. And for the first time since finding the Spanish workings, Elias understood something that chilled him deeper than the grizzlies' charge. This place was not meant to be reopened, not by Spaniards, not by friars, and not by mountain men with more courage than sense. Something had warned the old miners, something had driven them out, and now it watched Elias and his companions, waiting for its price. Return to the Green River. Rendezvous. Elias Carter's reckoning. When the great bear's body finally stopped twitching, the canyon fell into a silence so complete it felt carved from stone. Dust drifted lazily through shafts of late-afternoon light. The smell of powder and blood hung thick in the air. Baptiste leaned against a boulder, shaking from the nearness of death. Rowan knelt beside the fallen creature, chest heaving, face white with shock. Only Elias remained standing. He stared at the dead grizzly for a long moment, the echoes of its charge still pounding in his bones. Then he looked beyond it to the collapsed adit, the toppled timbers, the old Spanish crosses scratched into the cliff. The entire place seemed to watch him with a cold, patient gaze. "We're done here," Elias said quietly. Rowan whipped around. "Done? We're sitting on a fortune. You saw that vein. There's more. There's got to be more." Elias shook his head. "Not for us. Not for anyone." Rowan's eyes flashed with the fever of greed, the same madness that had driven him to set the powder charge. "You think I nearly died for nothing? We bring back enough ore, and we leave," Elias said again, sharper this time. "Now." It wasn't grizzly fear driving him. It wasn't the collapsing mine or Rowan's stupidity or even the danger of tribes watching from the ridges. It was something deeper, an instinct that came from the same place his grizzly reading gift lived. The canyon had revealed itself, yes, but it had also warned them. The Spaniards' crosses, the rotted supports, the collapsed barracks, the evidence whispered of a place abandoned, not because it failed, but because something made them leave. Whether it was death, collapse, or something more intangible, fear, curse, omen, Elias could not say. But he knew this. This mine would bring ruin to any man foolish enough to claim it. Baptiste nodded slowly, sensing the same truth. He is right. This place, it has a weight, a darkness. Rowan swallowed hard, still trembling. The explosion had rattled more than just the stone. It had rattled something inside him. At last he whispered, "Fine. We go." They took what little proof they had, one smelted bar, a few chunks of ore, and a single Spanish chisel. They covered the adit with fallen stones and dirt, hiding its shape as best they could. Elias scattered brush across the ledge to erase their tracks. When they left the canyon, Elias did not look back. Some places in the mountains belonged to no living man. They traveled fast. Rowan limped but recovered. The watchers on the ridges, Crow or Ute or some other band, kept their distance. Whether they knew of the canyon's secret or merely sensed trouble clinging to the newcomers, Elias never learned, but no arrows flew, no war cries rose. After weeks of hard travel, they crossed into safer country, and by the time they reached the high plains, the Spanish canyon already felt like a fevered dream. Rowan sold the small bar of silver in Taos. It fetched a modest price, not enough to turn heads, not enough to spark rumors of a mythical mine. Elias was relieved. Baptiste melted the remaining ore chunks into useless slag in a hot fire. "Better not to tempt devils," he said. They parted ways soon after. Rowan vanished toward Street Louis. Baptiste headed north to winter with a mixed band camp near the Yellowstone. Elias drifted alone for a time, working trap lines, guiding small outfits, avoiding crowded camps. He never returned to the canyon. He kept the Spanish map, yes, but more out of duty than desire. Years passed. Seasons shifted. Rendezvous came and went, each one louder than the last as the world pushed westward, and finally he found himself again at the Green River Rendezvous, older, scarred, quieter than ever. Which brings the story back to the firelight where he sat now, surrounded by curious young trappers waiting for the rest. His tale finished, the silence lingered long enough that even the horses seemed to listen. One youngster finally spoke. "So, the mine is still out there?" Elias stared into the flames. "Maybe, maybe not. The mountains keep what they want." "But you could find it again," said another. "If you went back." Elias's voice was low. "This land kills men who think they can own it. Spaniards learned that. Some Americans will too." The trappers exchanged frustrated looks. They wanted coordinates, bearings, direction. They wanted treasure, like all eager young fools do. But Elias only shook his head. "One day," he said, "someone might stumble across it. Not because they're huntin' gold, but because the mountain lets 'em. But if it's greed drivin' 'em." He tapped the scar on his cheek. "Then the land'll take its payment." "And the bear trick?" another asked. "That's real too? You can teach it?" Elias smiled, a thin, worn smile touched with the edges of memory. "I ain't got nothin' to teach. I only listened to what the land already knew." He stood, brushed dust from his trousers, and fixed his hat. "You boys want to hunt grizzlies safer? Learn the wind. Learn the ground. Don't force nothin'. The mountains talk plenty if you're quiet." As he walked away, the youngsters whispered, some scoffing, some wondering, all uncertain. The older trappers, though the ones with scars and gray in their beards, watched Elias leave with a different expression. They understood. Some men brought riches back from the frontier. Some brought scars. Some brought stories that the deepest treasures of the mountains were the ones not taken and the ones that kept a man alive long enough to walk away.